You'll have to pardon the wind today, but I was going to take this opportunity, as I'm mid-harvest, to talk a little bit about growing soybeans. I am sort of mid-harvest right now from our soybean patch, which was a very small little triangle. I don't know exactly how big it was. But as you can see, there are a lot of soybeans still on those plants. And as I was harvesting, it just got me thinking about a few things about soybeans and sort of the fact that from a smaller garden perspective, in at least North America, this is a plant that nobody even thinks of growing. And I think that's a little bit of a shame, because I will say up front, the downside to soybeans is for a small space garden, they may not work, because to get enough to do anything with, to get a usable amount from, you are going to need a bit of in-ground area. That being said, that area, as you saw there, with some of the open pollinated and heirloom type varieties, is actually pretty productive per plant, because soybeans are one of those plants, they can go quite close together, and after a few years of growing them, they're probably the most dirt simple legume, edible legume, that you could ever grow. And of course, for us, I guess that is saying something, because we grow a lot of dried beans. Mostly common beans, various pole beans and whatnot, but a few other Asian species as well. And we're big fans. But soybeans are often not even thought of as a garden vegetable. And I think given their potential as a food item and some of their versatility, although a little bit alien to some of us in sort of North American cuisine, they're still a very worthwhile addition to the garden if you do have the space that you could allocate to it. As you can see from these plants, one of the nice parts is, as I say, they can go quite close together, but each plant produces quite a few pods. They're really a plant it and forget it type of plant. The kind of only time you really have to do very much is at harvest and at planting. And harvest is a little bit forgiving depending on where you are, because you want the plants to dry out, or mostly dry out. Now, I should have harvested these potentially a week ago, because we have lost a few to splitting, but that's okay. It is what it is for this year. We've also lost a few to a completely different kind of garden pest. We typically aren't too concerned with the chickens in the garden once everything else is pretty much done, but we weren't really thinking and let the geese in. And even though poultry typically shouldn't eat uncooked soybeans, nobody told these guys that. So we've lost a little bit of our harvest, but I'm going to show you here just how simple this plant is to harvest. Like, dry pole beans, dry bush beans are pretty simple, but I think these are even easier. So bear with me here, but here's kind of what I've harvested so far. As you can see, all I'm doing is taking the pod. One thing I will reiterate, and we have a better video on harvesting soybeans from last year, which I'll link above, but you do want to wear gloves, because if you look closely at the pods, they're covered in these little hairs. And if you're sort of harvesting by hand, a smaller patch, you probably will get some irritation by the end of the day, or the end of the hour, or whatever it is that it takes you to harvest your patch by hand. So gloves, definitely recommended. But all you really have to do once they get to this state is pull the plant out and run your hand down the stalk. It's a little harder to do with one hand. And that's it. It's that simple. Now obviously you do have to get the bean out of the pod, but I hope that gives you a bit of an idea as far as labor involved. Now, you wouldn't plant acres of it and try to harvest it by hand. But hypothetically, you could if you needed to. And I think that's where soybean is a good sort of prepping plant. So one of the, I guess, benefits and downsides to soybeans is when the pod is dry enough, they split open very readily. Compared to a lot of your common bean varieties that sort of require a bit more shelling, they still come out pretty easy, but these, once they're sufficiently dry, are super easy to get out of the shell. And of course, there's your seed, your soybean. And I still am fascinated by the fact that this is one of the world's sort of most commonly consumed plants, or grown plants, a bit of both, and yet it's conspicuously absent from so many gardens, even though it has a very long history with sort of being grown in a less intensive agricultural manner. The variety that we grow is Gaia soybeans, which we really like them. They do really well and seem to be very productive. And as I've been harvesting, there has been quite the conference going on over there. Not 100% sure what they have so much to talk about, but I should have filmed it from the beginning. It was been quite entertaining. And they're not done yet. I have one little corner left of our little triangle patch of Gaia soybeans to harvest, and it just kind of another thing that popped into my head as I was harvesting was these are immensely, I don't even know how the proper word for it, a million times easier on a small scale than grains, i.e. wheat, oats, those type of things, to plant by hand and harvest by hand and actually get a reasonable yield. Because if you were to use these in cooking, for example, there's many different ways to do it, but some methods are very similar to other dry beans where you essentially soak them for a bit and they are going to be a little larger in size than they look when they're dried. So every year we do this, I just think this is such an easy plant to grow. Well, as you can see behind me, the patch is all harvested. I've got them all out. I should have tracked my time. I didn't. I think I've been, even with farting around with the camera and whatnot, probably been maybe 45 minutes tops, and I wasn't exactly working at breakneck speed, so it's not exactly a hard task. And the next part is just to take the bucket of beans, dump it out into a bit of a tray, and put them in basically a warm, dry location. So for us, they're going to go in the greenhouse, because that worked amazing last year. And then it's really not too hard to separate the beans from the pods. Well, we are now several days later, or several weeks later, I believe, because we kind of put these soybeans in the greenhouse and left them, and it's a great spot to dry them, but we had a bit of a mishap, either a mouse or a squirrel or multiples or both, essentially can get into the greenhouse. And anyways, what basically happened was the mouse slash chipmunk decided to steal some of the soybeans and make off with them. So we've got less this year for harvest than I anticipated, but there is our bowl full of soybeans. And this was 332 grams that we ended up with, which isn't super terrible when you think of the amount of effort that went into growing these. So basically, once the soybeans have dried, the next step is to get them out of the shells, which is quite simple. We basically just step on them, and for the most part, they pop right out. And then we winnow them, which is basically what we're doing here, where you're just trying to get rid of all the fines, which if you go on a nice windy day, as we're doing here, they basically the soybeans are heavy enough, they fall into the bowl, and all the fine material blows out, which ends for some fairly clean beans. I believe we talked about this last year, that we were hoping to use some of these soybeans in some cooking recipes, very similar to how you would use basically dry beans and dried common beans. So we're really hoping to get to that this year, but this is kind of just a video to show you that with very little effort, and barring any mishaps with rodents, you can actually produce a fair number of soybeans at home with basically very little time or effort spent on the process.